All right. So yes, Serge, temperature control. Take it away.
Yeah. Right. Let me figure this one out. Right. What can you see? Can you see the presentation mode, or can you see the presentation?
You can see the presenter's view at the moment.
Right. Let's try it in a different way. You should see absolutely nothing except for the desktop background. And now you should see a presentation.
Yep. Yep. That's working now.
Wonderful. It's actually presenting on my switched off TV. Because I have it hooked up to the PC. So temperature control, and obviously we have a white sweaty t-shirt, right? So I didn't want to get down to the nitty-gritty of temperature control because, first of all, there are multiple methods and multiple ways of going about it. Secondly, we have so many people here who already know an awful lot about how to control temperature of their beer. There are multiple devices, multiple approaches. So instead, I wanted to give an overview to perhaps people who are new to brewing and who don't know all that much about it or haven't had the experience, etc. So for those who are, have their fermentation chambers and blah, 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 you probably will learn absolutely nothing new, but I would love if you stayed anyway. Yeah, it's kind of a high level, if you will. Obviously, why the hell would we want to control our fermentation temperature? Well, there are a few reasons that I've come up with. First of all, you've seen on yeast manufacturer websites, you've tried a few times, and yeast usually have a preferred temperature window for the optimal fermentation to produce that desired set of characteristics, aromas, flavors, etc. And while yeast often works outside of that window, sometimes it's a bit sluggish. Sometimes it's a little too hot and starts producing flavors that you don't want. Fermentations occur exothermically, so when it happens, you get a release of heat. It warms up naturally. All right. Also, you often find that a very particular combination of aromas and the Hefeweizen sort of links up into this. I'm sure James and Lee will talk about it next month, about fermentation temperature specifically, but there's a very narrow window when you get that really perfect balance of clove and banana. And obviously there are many other things you can do in your brewing before that, but if you ferment it too cold or too warm, you will still not get that balance. You will not achieve it. Above some temperatures for some kinds of yeast, you get really nasty flavors, fusel alcohols. They can give you a headache. They have given me headaches a few times. When you have a beer and you're like, oof, like, yeah, it is the beer. It is because it was fermented inappropriately. Also, some yeasts just go to sleep. The moment temperature is not high enough, you see them flocculate, get together, and fall out, and they never wake up again. You might be able to restart fermentation by just upping the temperature, but you also might need to use additional yeast. I've had a problem like that many years ago when nothing, absolutely nothing restarted fermentation. I had to pitch extra yeast because it was just too cold. Talk about saving on your heating. Also, it's really important in the beginning of fermentation because a lot of kind of esters are produced right at the start in the growth phase, and if temperature is allowed to run away, yeast can get a little bit stressed, especially for those high gravity beers, etc. And you just end up with a mess from day 1 or 2, and then there's very little you can do to fix the flavor and aroma of your beer. And for high gravity beers specifically, I would always recommend to ferment a couple of degrees lower, obviously as long as the yeast allows, because you have so much osmotic pressure on the yeast from all the sugars that it's already working really hard. It's almost akin to fermenting, a degree or two higher than the actual temperature is. And I think all of these things are valid, but the last one, for me, is very, very important. It's consistency and repeatability, because you make a fantastic beer and you've controlled all your variables, but your temperature was completely all over the place. And can you brew it again? Well, you can give it a go. You won't get the same beer. So you really that is one of the variables that you can control. It's difficult to control quite often. We'll get into that in a moment. But to repeat a batch, you need to be able to control it. And I want to say famously, but allegedly, fullers don't just go through temperature steps of, 1 day at 19, 2 days at 22, etc. They actually go in terms of hours. They go up and then they go down and they go up again, etc. The fermentation is kind of like all over the place, almost mimicking the natural temperatures of the day. And it was an interesting presentation by the former Fuller's head brewer a few years back that I attended. Shocked me, frankly, because it almost mimics the constant fluctuations in the temperature. So we'll talk about two aspects today. One of them is heating, one of them is cooling. Heating, well, really, really, really simple. Put the fermenter somewhere warm, insulated, bubble wrap, thermofoil, sleeping bag, an old duvet, pillows, anything like that absolutely keeps the temperature in and allows your beer to warm up even further because of that exothermic reaction. So your beer will not go cold until it's finished fermenting. Or you could, for a little bit more control, if you don't want your beer to warm up too high, for example, and your ambient temperature allows you to keep it fairly cool, then you get a heating belt, you get a temperature control. An Ingberg is about 30 quid, and it's one of the best investments in a home brewery because it allows you to control heating and cooling devices, not heating and cooling itself. So you wrap around the heating belt around your fermenter, plug into the heating plug on the Ingberg, set a temperature, attach a thermal probe to your fermenter from the outside, and off you go. Point to note, the fermentation temperature in the middle of your fermenter will be a couple of degrees higher than on the outside. So when you're setting any temperatures for cooling or for heating, you do need to take that into account. That fermentation is hotter than what you're registering on the outside of the fermenter or in the ambient air if it's in a chamber. So yeah, that's heating. Any questions on heating before I get into the actual presentation?
Quick one for you there, Serge. You just mentioned that you've got the difference in temperature in the middle and the outside. What constitutes the correct one, I wonder, if there is one?
I would say an average. So if you have a thermal that goes right into the middle of your beer, I would take an average. And I wouldn't call it correct. It's just an average temperature because your any kind of fermenter, whether it's jacketed, whether it's not, whether it's in your fridge, or whether it's outside, will always have a gradient of temperature throughout the volume, depending on when your cooling rings are, etc. You will never get one consistent fermentation temp throughout. So an average is what you should be aiming for.
Any thoughts on heating mechanism? So you've got a heating belt there, right? It might have been a mistake, I'm not sure, but I bought a heating pad, one of these circular pads that goes under the fermenter, and I've been using that, but I've been reading that it might cause off flavors because it's heating underneath the yeast cake.
So that depends on how hot it gets, right? Because if your heating pad gets really hot, then I anecdotally would say that is not great for your yeast health and viability, etc. Yeah. So if getting kind of your high powered heating device, I would prefer something that goes around the outside and above the yeast cake. However, there are some which are brewing specific, and Grainfather actually use them in their conical fermenters, which output a very particular small amount of heat that does not affect the health of your yeast egg, or so they claim. I've at least, I've used that fermenter for years now, and I never encountered problems from heating, and I've had to heat a few beers.
Yeah, I was thinking of getting the belt. I'll compare and contrast and feed it back.
Yeah. Also, another thing you can do with the belt is, depending on where it is, you can actually control your temperature that way. So let's say you put it, closer towards the bottom, you will be heating a higher volume than if you put it towards the top, because obviously, I don't know whatever grade in England GCSE physics, hot liquid stays at the top, cold liquid of the same density stays at the bottom. Or rather, density changes, if we're being pedantic about it.
And if you've got an ale yeast then that's sort of doing its stuff at the top, and you bring the belt higher up, do you think that would have a more sort of topical effect?
Fermentation happens throughout your vessel.
Okay.
What you have is yeast throws out yeast to the top, which is more common for the ale yeast with a high Kreuzen, whereas for Lager Pastorianus yeast, you get more of it at the bottom. But the fermentation happens throughout the entire thing.
Great, thank you.
One thing I've tried that seems to work quite well, and I've got a heat belt, and I use it in the fridge. So rather than clamp the heat belt around the outside of the fermenter, and they do get quite warm, is to kind of lay it loose. And you might want to try that with your heat pad, David. I kind of lay it. So what I do is shut the fridge door, basically, set the Ingbird for whatever it is, 25 if it's a 29 if it's a Saison or something like that. And the fridge is just as well insulated for heat as it is for cold. So instead of having the heat belt actually on the fermenter, it just heats the box, if you like.
Right. You heat the space, not the vessel. Yeah.
Yeah. So then you kind of avoid, boiling the thing from underneath.
Yeah. That's if you're fermenting in a chamber. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And I found that works as quite stable that way. So I'm just going to keep opening the door.
Are you going to talk about calibration of your thermometers, Serge?
Nope, not at all.
Do you think it's worth calibrating your digital instruments?
I think it's absolutely worth calibrating any measurement instruments, as long as you have something to calibrate it against, which is often the problem. Because you know the stick-on temperature strips. Well, they're wildly inaccurate. Ingbird, I have a thermopen, and Ingbird is plus or minus there within a degree. At least the one that I have. But for 1 degree, I wouldn't worry too much when you're already using something like a heat belt or indirect heating, because you're already going to get a temperature gradient. So again, unless you have something that is precise and accurate, I wouldn't, stress about it. But if you have something precise and accurate, then you should totally calibrate your equipment.
So you wouldn't necessarily want to use iced water or boiling water?
You could, but then we should probably use distilled ice and distilled water, and then boiled distilled water. Otherwise, you're already introducing variables.
And at sea level, of course.
And at sea level, or adjust for it. So again, I think for our brewing purposes, it's not as important to calibrate it to a decimal point. I think plus or minus half a degree is accurate enough. But
So the temperature difference between a probe on the outside of a plastic in a chamber, do you reckon were you saying it's like a couple of degrees hotter inside? Because I think I've inappropriately gone the other way. I thought it was cooler inside the fermenter. So you reckon it's a couple of degrees hotter?
It absolutely is, because your ambient air is usually colder than inside of your fermenter, unless you're fermenting in 30 degrees heat, and then you're fermenting something at 20, if you're managing to keep it cool. But we'll get into cooling. Generally speaking, the bigger the diameter of your fermenter, the bigger is the difference between the outside and the inside. So tall and narrow, very little difference. Squat and wide, you considerably hotter. So you can assume a degree regardless. If it's a very wide fermenter, I would go for 2. Or you could, if your fermenter allows, and if you're able to, get a thermowell and actually drop it right into the middle where your fermentation is, and drop the thermal probe into that thermowell, because that would give you the most accurate reading that you can get, and then you can use that number without adjustments.
Okay.
Right. Let's get into cooling. Not very simple. Many methods. Some really cheap, some extremely expensive, and some very involved with a lot of different parts and looking things. There are middle grounds. It doesn't mean you have to sell a kidney or 2 to get there. You can get really good results with very little money in reality. So, level 1. Just don't bother. Become friends with nature. Brew your beer seasonally. You brew your Belgians and Saisons in the summer. Your ales, autumn and spring. Lagers during winter, and move somewhere behind the polar circle and make an ice box. You absolutely can, and I still brew my ferment my mixed fermentations mostly 9 out of 10. I just whatever temperature I have in the room and in the cupboard, in the wardrobe, etc. And that's actually my setup for the previous presentation that I did a year ago. Sometimes I would conduct a controlled primary fermentation temperature-wise, but then I would let it go. But for some, I just don't bother. Fill the vessel, leave it. You can use spaces that you already have, which have a somewhat stable temperature. So if you're lucky to have a cellar or a shady garden shed, and after I wrote it, and I'm just thinking like shady garden shed just sounds a bit shady. But if you have a garden shed in the shade, then absolutely use it. Anywhere the temperature is a little cool, a little stable. We all have those places around our living spaces. I used to ferment in a wardrobe for years. I had one wardrobe for my clothes and one wardrobe for my beer. The one for the beer was obviously bigger. Yeah, priorities, and temperature there hasn't really changed much, not just throughout the day, but throughout the year. It was about 18 to 20 degrees consistently, no matter, the sun, no matter, how cold it is. It was pretty solid, obviously closed doors and don't open too often. And you're just at the mercy of the weather, but you can absolutely work with it. So if you time your beers right, you can absolutely do it. And you can get fantastic beers out of it. Level 2, bucket in a bucket. Doesn't have to be a bucket fermenter, but this is the most common example. You just fill a big bucket with water or ice, or ideally a mixture of the 2. You stick your fermenter in there, and you just leave it. All you need to do is take a temperature reading from a stick-on thermometer, like you can see on the photo, for example, to give you a rough idea where it is. Add some more ice, take a bit of water out, etc. You can quite successfully use this, and I've heard of people doing this, especially for ales where you don't have a fermentation too long, a couple of days. It just needs constant attention. A couple of times a day, you need to say hello to your beer and take care of it. It obviously lacks precision. Temperature goes up and down, but sometimes it's better than nothing, especially if your ambient is really, really high. The next one of that is 2.5, and that's a dressed bucket in a bucket. Just stick an old t-shirt or a bit of cloth over it, because with that extra evaporation of the material of the cloth, you're going to get a greater cooling effect. But all the problems still remain. It's just this one keeps it slightly cooler. And then you can use that cloth to mop your floor afterwards if you like. Level 3, dressed bucket in a bucket, but with a fan. So your fan will drive an airflow across your cloth, and it will drive even more evaporation from it, thus having an even better cooling effect. Obviously here you have to not only watch out for temperature changes, but also that you have enough water or ice in the bucket, because surprisingly, with a fan, evaporation is pretty quick. But all the same problems remain. I would use this as a trial if you haven't tried temperature control at all of any kind before. This would be my approach. Just wrap it in a cloth, stick it in a bucket, and you'll be able to keep things a little cooler. Level 4. Now we're getting into kind of involved methods. So you can insulate your fermenter and use a frozen saline solution. And this photo is actually of my beer brew, if you will. Before I got a conical fermenter, which I'll talk about later. But yeah, I had a kind of a standard plastic fermenter, my very first one that actually got me into brewing. And it was a sleeping bag wrapped around it. And in the corners, there were 4 2-liter bottles with frozen saline solution. I've done some modeling on the best ratio of water to salt by weight, and 15% was the sweet spot, because effectively you get the biggest amount of cooling from the transition from one state of the matter to the other, so solid to liquid in our case. So if you're looking at the total cooling potential of something, you have to consider 3 points. First of all, heat required to bring up to a melting point, then required to transition from solid to liquid, and then to bring up to the temperature of your fermentation to equalize with it. So I've dug up some of my old equations, and 15% by weight of water to salt was the sweet spot. It freezes around -11 C. So most home freezers are able to do that in a matter of 6 to 8 hours. And I had 6 bottles on the go, 4 in use, 2 in the freezer. You're swapping them 2-3 times a day, and I got really, really good results in terms of being able to control my temperature. Some beers I had to swap 3 times a day, which were vigorous, which I wanted fermented cooler. Some only twice. But then sometimes when I stayed out for a little too long, I would come home completely drunk, and my beer needs attention, and all I want to do is have my kebab and sleep, etc. So sometimes it ran away, but it's only because I didn't look after it. I guess it's like if you don't feed the child will cry. Well, that's the same here. You really need to be there, but that's the same problem as you had with the bucket solution, except for here. You have to change it a little less often, and you have a bit more control, because depending on the number of bottles you have in there, you can see what your temperature is.
And Serge, what are you using the ink bird for there?
Oh, just to tell me what the temperature is.
Okay.
So that I don't.
Bottles?
Sorry?
Where are the bottles? Are they underneath that sleeping bag?
They would have been had I had a photo of the bottles in there. This I for some reason I thought I had many more photos of my setups from previous years, but this is the only one I have actually found. But yeah, there would be 4 bottles. The way I do it really is wrap the sleeping bag around a bit loosely. You use some what do you call them, like stretchy hooky ties. You use in camping quite often. Honestly, don't remember what you call them.
Bungee things.
There you go. The
bungee cords.
The bungee cords. So a couple of bungee cords, And then I would just like place a bottle into each corner, sorted. And then you kind of, you see if your fermentation starts to slow down, you take one bottle out, etc. Like you get the hang of it, and that's where the temperature comes in handy, because you don't want to unwrap it and rewrap every time, because it's faff, and obviously you're losing a bit of that cooling, because sipping back insulates both sides, of course. Any other questions on this one? Right. Let's go up one level. Now we're getting into the right. Let's spend some money. Let's get some interesting kit. So submerged cooling coil. So I've stolen this diagram from Serge Brewtech website and the photo from underneath it as well. In effect, you're submerging a coil which runs a coolant, and it's submerged right into the middle of your beer, where your beer is the hottest. You're running cold water or cold solution of any kind through it. It chills the beer. Everybody's happy. You can also use a heating pad at the bottom, or a heating belt around the bottom of your fermenter. It doesn't have to be a conical. It can be literally any. I've seen so many examples of these your coils online. There are branded ones, no-name ones, AliExpress ones, etc. Ultimately, it's just a loop of a system, as you can see in the diagram. Let me get the laser pointer. Yay! So you have a pump that's usually in a bucket or coolant of some sort. It pumps cold water through the coil. It exits out and into your bucket. And this is what you need to keep cool. What this achieves is quite precise control over the temperature inside of your fermenter, because with that invert, whether it's measuring temperature through the thermal well or from the outside of the fermenter, the moment the temperature reaches your target, whether by heating or by cooling, it turns off. It stops heating or cooling, right? And it doesn't just pump the water. So as long as your cooling solution is adequate in terms of its ability to cool a much bigger, usually volume of beer, then the temperature control is absolutely fantastic and on point. My problem with this, and this is why I would never recommend this approach to anybody, and that is my personal opinion, is that, God, it's just so much faff with cleaning this coil, and an awful lot of just components and things that could get a little dirty. You have to disassemble it every time. You have to reassemble it every time. And I hate cleaning, and the less of it I can do, the better. So I would not use this approach. However, the approach I did use is the one up, and that's a jacketed fermenter. Exactly the same principle as this submerging the coil, except for you have two walls in your fermenter. So you have the inner wall, which encases your beer, and you have the outer wall, and between them there's a space, and you pump the coolant through that space in between two walls. And that is how professional fermenters are usually designed. So that way you don't have any extra cleaning, because frankly, it doesn't really matter. You're pumping it through the outside, never comes in contact with the beer. You're usually getting quite a large area of cooling, so it can be a little more effective. I'm not going to be claiming that it's more or less effective, but it certainly can be. But the rest of the problems of chilling your coolant, which is usually the kind of the problem, that stays the same, right? So the diagram fully applies. It's just instead of this coil here, you have the walls that are doubled. But this has been my solution for years, and I have produced some fantastic beers with this. So this is viable, except for obviously the fermenter itself can be expensive. Is it more expensive as any of the fancy fermenters out there? No, actually, it's about 500 quid for the Grainfather, and for a shiny stainless steel that says Brewtech, you'd probably pay more for the same volume. So thank you, James, all those years ago, for recommending me to go this route. Right, let's go one up. The one you're all familiar with, you've seen before, is a fermentation fridge. That's obviously the homebrewer's choice. I don't know, shout if you don't have one. I feel like every brewer in the lab has a fermentation fridge. But
I do submerged coil.
sorry?
I do the submerged coil.
Do you?
Yeah.
How does
It
that
is a
work?
faff. I'm not going to lie, but I can't fit a fridge. So
Fair. Anybody else on the, who does the coil?
No, I put it in the cellar and use the heating pad. I don't have a room for a fridge either.
I
Yeah,
think,
I've got a coil for my SS fermenter, but it's never bothered to fit it yet.
yeah. I genuinely considered it, but I was like, cleaning that. I'll just start cutting corners. I know myself with those things.
I think it's
I think-
definitely one to employ some automation on that side to get a pump and a spray ball and
Yeah, but
blast through cleaning chemicals to it. But
that's extra kit, extra expenses.
Yeah.
etc.
You definitely want a CIP set up for when you got this submerged coil. I think it
Yeah.
makes it a lot easier.
yeah, I don't do the swapping out bottles as well. I use like a shelf chiller to cool the coolant, which helps a bit. But
It does. It certainly does. That's actually on shelf chiller. One thing I completely forgot about in this whole presentation. But thank you for that. Yeah, the cooling you can do water, ice water, frozen bottles, a shelf chiller. You just effectively plug it into a closed loop. Right. So fermentation fridge. You can pick an extra fridge for quite a little bit of money. You can go as involved with the actual control your fermentation as you want, or as simple. I think Inkbird is still my choice if I would want to go this route. But you can go, you can pit, you can go brew pie, you can brew pileless, so that the actual thermal probe inside of your beer thermally takes readings and then controls the heating, etc. We've had a long chat about that a couple of months ago. So, and any of these methods obviously apply to all others I've mentioned that involves a controller. You can automate this in a really, really nice way. But if you are looking after your budget, a cheap secondhand fridge and an Inkbird does the job just as well. The big advantage of this solution over anything I've mentioned before, so far, is that you can cold crash and lager, because your fridge is able to go down to nearly freezing temperatures, and therefore whatever it contains can go down to those same temperatures. So this is something you achieve with a fridge. Couple of downside, obviously space, and if to conduct multiple fermentations, you need separate fridges if your multiple fermentations are at different temperatures themselves, but obviously in terms of your schedules, in terms of 2 days of this temp here, 3 days of that temp there, etc. So I think famously Lee has 4 fermentation fridges. So that is certainly the route if you have the space, but I do not. Next one is rate the aquarium store, and I'll talk. This is my current setup picture taken today. I'm sorry for the mess. It's exactly the same setup as the submerged coil jacketed fermenter, except for that picnic cooler, etc. I've replaced with an aquarium chiller. I picked one up quite cheaply, 120 quid on eBay, and it's plugged into closed loop. And I set the grandfather control to whatever temperature I need or whatever schedule I need. And then the moment it detects that temperature is a little high or a little low, if it's a little high, it starts pumping. The moment the cooler detects that the temperature of the coolant being pumped through is a little high, it starts chilling it. So it's not always on. It only works as you expect when it needs to. You can obviously set the temperature of the coolant on the aquarium chiller itself. This one, the Haley HC100A, goes down to 3 degrees C. You can play around with calibration, and you can set it lower to the point that I got it to freeze a couple of times. So it has potential to cool below 0. So I am thinking of actually popping in glycol into it as an improvement. So all the advantages of the system: set and forget, precise temperature control. I got this in November, and I'm consistently able to chill beers down to 8-9 degrees even during fermentation. So 10C fermentation of a lager is just not a problem whatsoever. It takes very little space in reality. Partially, there's a benefit from this insulation, because you would have a lot of heating from the outside, so you would ideally need to insulate your fermenter. And also, if you don't insulate, you're going to have an issue with condensation, right? But other than that, it works really well. I am crash cooling a beer just now, and it's at about 10C. It's pretty hot, so I'll see how it works in the hotter days, but I think there's about a 2C temperature increase for the summer months. But I can totally live with that, because even if I take a lager fermentation at a level of degrees, it's something I've never been able to do before until last November. Huge downside is bloody loud. It's really, really, really loud. I can hear it from here, from my kitchen right now. It's about, let's call it 7 meters. So to sleep, I close my bedroom door, and then I can't hear it. But that is something you probably can fix depending on how big your living space is where your fermentation happens.
Serge, that thing about the loudness, those with shelf chillers, things like that, they know they can be loud as well. But what do you think is it that's making it loud in that? Is it the pump?
It's the compressor.
It's the compressor, is it? Right.
Yeah, it's not the pump.
Okay.
The pump itself is an aquarium pump. And one thing to note, I've tried to have it in a completely sealed closed loop, but because the pump that I have.
Oh, wait on, where's the pump?
In here.
Is the pump outside of that unit?
Yes. So the unit itself doesn't have a pump.
Oh, I beg your pardon. I thought it did.
The pump is controlled by the grain father, and I'm using literally a pint glass as the exchange for the pump to pick up water, and from the chiller to dump cold water. Obviously, extremely inefficient. A huge, thermal impact from your surroundings in here. So I think I can actually better these temperatures if I have a fully insulated loop, and I've got some thoughts on that. But the reason the pump is in water, because it's a submergible pump and it's not entirely sealed. So if I've tried running it without, but you end up with a lot of air pickup due to poor sealing and obviously coolant loss. So at some point it stops running because there's not enough water. But there are ways about it, and once I get to it, I was supposed to get to it a couple of months ago, but once I get to it, I will probably do an update on Slack on how the setup works. But I'm extremely happy with this, because for 120 quid, I can now brew lager and not worry about it at all.
So if your glycol chiller or your chiller doesn't have a pump, how is the water from the chiller getting into the glass?
So the pump pumps it all the way up, right? And then it, by virtue of that, pumps it all the way down into the chiller and up again, or rather down into the glass. So you
what's bringing it out of the chiller into the glass? How is that happening?
Give me a second. So you are, imagine that's the chiller, and you have a, imagine that's the chiller, right? And you have a pump here. So the pump picks up the water from the exchange reservoir, and literally pushes it through the coil. And because it pushes it, it also pushes the water out into the chiller, and the chiller has an inner chamber that if you push water into it, water has to come out.
Okay.
So
So
that's
the water in that cup remains at the same level in that pint glass.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Obviously it evaporates, so you need to top up, I don't know, once every couple of weeks. There is an issue with the pint glass being open. You get lint and dust collecting, so then it becomes a bit manky. But again, because it doesn't touch my beer, I don't really care as long as it keeps pumping.
Is there no way you could put that pump in the chiller?
Not into this one. It's a molded plastic container, and I will try to take it apart, and I will try to have a look at it. Like I just need a weekend aside to get properly busy. My other solution is to get like a mason jar, 2 holes inside, insulated from the outside, and then mount it somewhere close to here so that you don't get any or very little thermal impact from what your ambient is. And I think I can really drop these temperatures. So yeah, I think I'm going to keep this for well, until it breaks, and then I'll see what I do. But there is.
Do you think it'll break, Serge?
You know what? I think.
Will this be shortly after you take it to bits to have a look?
No, I think the pump will go first. First of all, this pump has been in use for 4 years now, and it's been running, you know, most times of most days over that period. And sometimes, and this is a very recent problem, sometimes it doesn't start. If you give it a shake, it keeps going. But I caught a few times that the pump is just not started. There is current. You give it a shake and it gets going, so it doesn't prime itself. So I think something is getting worn out. So I might replace a pump, but it's a cheap job, 5-10 quid off eBay, a bit of soldering, and you're done. Right, last one. Level 9, go big or go home, glycol. All the control you want, set and forget. Most glycol chillers can handle multiple fermenters. I've on one of our interclub meetups, there was a lad, I think in Manchester, who actually was setting up a brand new brewery with a combination of glycol chillers from Grainfather and Grainfather fermenters, and that was his entire approach to low scale brewing, because Grainfather chiller can handle 4 fermenters, and you can go up in size and power, obviously in cost. I think it takes less space than multiple fridges. Yes, it's more expensive, but you know, you could just brew a fantastic beer using one of the methods before, and then win Lager Than Life, for which in the past 2 years running, I believe, 2 times running, we had a glycol chiller as the main present. So yeah, that's me. Thank you all for listening. Any questions? Any comments? Any contributions?
Yeah, just on the glycol chiller, I think there's a company in Australia called Keg King, something like that. It makes a very, very compact glycol chiller, which seems to be quite effective for about £200, I think it is, something like that. Not quite over here yet. It's got into Europe, but it hasn't come to the UK. So that's worth looking out for. But if you can't be bothered with all of that, there are 2 other things you can do. For certain styles, you can pressure ferment, and you don't have to worry too much about temperature. And for other styles, you can use certain yeasts where temperature isn't necessarily an issue. Is that correct, Serge?
Yeah, absolutely. Perfectly valid. I did not specifically consider that aspect here, but totally valid approach. And I am looking forward to that Kegland or Kegging or whatever, making it over here, because yeah, I would like to be able to lager, and my current setup doesn't let me do that. But I'm okay with it because I bottle condition anyway, and you know, cooling down to 8 degrees is enough to drop most of the yeast out, and then I need the rest of the yeast in the beer to actually carbonate anyway. So that works for me.
I just got a question about the different levels, because most people won't go to level 9, and there's a lot of brewing experience on this call. What was the one kind of promotion, i.e. from one level to another level, that's given the most improvement in beer, that fixed the most problems, I guess?
I think it's going. I think it's going from level 3 to level 4, in my personal experience. But then afterwards, you get into a cooling coil, a jacketed fermenter, or a fridge. And I think a fridge for most people, myself excluding, is probably the best option. And that's why I marked it as homebrewer's choice, because that seems to be so popular and great results all around.
And to most people who've moved up to a fridge, I guess the follow-on question is, most people who've moved up for a fridge, can they attest to an improvement in fermentation character and profile?
Yeah,
and so on?
I did. I got the first way I did it was like an under-the-counter fridge off eBay for about 10 or 20 quid maybe, plus the Inkbird, which was maybe 25, I think, at the time, something like that. So for about 40 or 50 quid, you could then start doing lagers pretty easily. And it made a massive difference to the quality of the beer, I think, because it was stable temperature and it was cold as well. But if, with a brew belt and a fridge and an Inkbird, you can kind of really easily control temperatures from 2 degrees up to 29, 30, depending on whether you're heating or chilling in a little under the counter fridge. So yeah, short answer, a fridge.
In 2018, sorry, in 2018, when it was Beast from the East, we'd only just started brewing, and we did one that was an absolute total complete disaster, just leaving it in a room, and that just didn't work at all. So after that, we got 4 fridges, one at a time. I mean, we got one and then we got one a bit later, but they were all free off Free Cycle or eBay or whatever, and converted those with Dimplex heaters. And so we now, between us, at our 2 locations, have 4 fridges that we can all have, that can all be at different temperatures.
Yeah, the fridge seemed to be the way to go, particularly because you're warming the air inside or cooling the air, which does give you quite good control over the temperature of the beer. I mean, going back to the difference in temperature, there is a slight vertical difference I picked up just by using an eye spindle and using the Thermo well on a fermenter, and finding that the 8 or 10 inches height difference is about a 1/4 degree warmer at the top, I picked up.
Yeah, but that would be very specific to your system and your fermenter.
Oh yeah. I mean, as you said before, going for an average is sort of all you can really do.
Yeah, in the Grainfather, let's see, get a picture. So the thermal probe is roughly here, and my eye spindle is roughly here, and I get about 0.5, 0.7 degree difference between the two. Obviously, I cannot calibrate the Grainfather probe, but that's
but you are getting between, say, a 1/4 and a 1/2 degree difference. Yeah, which is sort of what I was picking up.
Yeah, and I expect that ultimately less dense, hotter liquid at the top.
One for you here, Serge, is you were talking about wanting to get into lagering, and you use those great big, are they 5-gallon, like demijohns, whatever you want to call them, carboys?
These ones?
Yeah.
Yeah, this is not my photo. This is a random
Oh,
photo.
it's somebody else's, is it? Oh, it's somebody else's, is it?
a random
Oh,
photo.
it's somebody else's, is it? Oh. I thought it was looking a bit neat. Yeah. You
Thank you,
can
Mark.
buy. You can get well, I've seen them in America, or you can get them from there. Those things which are refrigeration units with rods on them that you put on carboys.
Yeah, it's the brew jacket.
Yeah, I
The
excluded that
Peltier
from.
cooler.
Yeah, I excluded that from here because we struggle to get it in the UK. But yeah, you literally insert a rod into your beer.
I've heard the Peltier coolers aren't quite up to it yet. I think they also have problems in localized effect. Getting that cooling effect out into the beer is tricky, from what I gather. And I don't think that the temperature difference is really good enough. Well, the amount of energy they use is meant to be quite high for the effect. So it's going to cost you. Peltiers cost a lot of money to run.
I spent a long time trying to bodge a Peltier solution and couldn't even get close. It was like, on paper it should work, but
you can make a very small amount of very small volume of liquid cold, but you try and scale that up to 25 liters, and you're using a lot of energy.
And the chip itself produces a lot of heat that you've then
Yeah.
got to take away from the beer as well.
Yeah.
I will note one thing though. Most recently, Joey got a gold for his Vienna lager at Lager Than Life, just fermenting outside. So that is an entirely viable. I have a couple of medals which was fermented with absolutely no temperature control.
I think Ken, who's the silver in the national homebrew competition last time it was run, I think, he basically ferments under his stairs. It says it just doesn't change temperature all year. So
yeah, so it's all about learning your system, learning your environment. So you don't really have to invest much, or you can go Steve's way and spend those 40, 50 quid and actually get really fantastic results. I've included these mostly for fun. I probably would not recommend anybody actually do this because it's really involved, takes a lot of space, but it's, yeah. I would go straight into this if you're thinking about it, and you can do it on the cheap.
I think even with a fridge, there's still a few things to think about as well. So I ended up actually going with a freezer because I was really interested in cold crashing, and particularly I'd kind of heard a podcast, the Beersmith podcast with Charlie Bamforth, where he talked about cold crashing to kind of 0 or even -1 being much more effective and much faster than kind of going to kind of 4 or 5 degrees. And I thought, well, that sounds good. I'll go for a freezer. And then kind of obviously the issue then is trying to find something that actually a fermenter that actually fits into it. And so if you're going under county, you have to be quite careful about, you're going to restrict your choices of fermenter and in terms of what goes in there. And there's a few other kind of other little gotchas as well, like, where if you want to drill holes in it, because otherwise you end up having the door slightly ajar and having kind of, I mean, I have like a big blow off tube that actually I've put into like a corny keg so I can flush it with the CO2. But having like a 1/2-inch silicone hose poking out of your fridge door isn't that convenient. And the other bit as well, kind of just thinking about if you want kind of to do like a stepped fermentation where the temperature is increasing, you kind of need to think about how you can kind of do that quite carefully in terms of, do you just like, keeping the door open for a bit or turn the heater on? And particularly I've noticed with the Inkbirds, they tend to have kind of 2 features. I'm going to say flaws, but maybe features is fairer, where they don't necessarily respond that quickly to temperature changes. But then also they have like this thing where they randomly walk around. And so you'll notice that the kind of the temperature sometimes will just like leap by 1 degree and then kind of come down quite rapidly. But just that leap is suddenly enough for the compressor to kind of turn on, for example. And so you get this kind of like thing where it's kind of flickering off. So there's all sorts of little gotchas which just can make it a bit more challenging to use. But it's great for temperature control.
Are you sure you don't just have a faulty one?
It's now, I was looking at some stuff on a homebrew forum and everything. There was literally hundreds of posts in terms of has anybody else noticed this?
the Inkbird has a fault in it. that where I don't know whether it's when the temperature probe starts to go or something like that. You'll see, because I've seen it myself. I've got one that controls my Keyser, and I didn't believe it. And then one day I saw it happen. It literally just suddenly jumped by like 1.8 degrees and then straight back down like a second later.
Yeah, it's a
and that was it.
well-known, undocumented feature.
Yes.
But I don't know if you can replace the temperature probe on them though.
Yeah, no, well, there is a model which you can, but for most of them, no, it's you chuck it away and buy a new one. But in the most cases, as long as you've got your sort of temperature band at a degree, it shouldn't really matter too much because it's not pushing things too far either way. I mean, it's just, yeah.
My hysteresis on the invert was always set to 0.3 of a degree. So it would just respond very quickly to whatever changes, and possibly that's why I've never noticed any problems with it, and I've had mine for 5 years or so.
And also make sure you always have the compressor delay set on. So it should be sort of 1 or 2 minutes before it actually brings the any cooling on.
And the temperature probe insulated so that it doesn't get affected by you opening the door.
Yeah. Bubble wrap around the outside of it. If you're sticking it to the side of the fermenter, bubble wrap and some duct tape works pretty well.
I was wondering what the difference is between, if you kind of have a corny keg being pressure fermented, what the difference is between the inside of the keg and the outside where you've just got it on the side, the temperature probe on the side.
I think there's a difference, but I don't think it's that massive. It's not like, again, in commercial areas where you have thousands of liters being fermented, and when that fermentation gets going, the middle of it's going to be quite warm and the outside of it might be a lot cooler. Whereas we're dealing with a lot smaller volumes, so I don't think it's as much of an issue for us.
Agreed.
But you still want to avoid the sort of wild swings anyway.
It stresses the yeast more than anything. Sorry?
Well, I was thinking, there's lots of kind of Belgian styles where kind of it just says, start at 18 degrees or whatever and let it rise to wherever it wants to be. And actually, it's quite difficult to do that sort of thing when you are doing temperature control. Unless you literally kind of just, particularly inside a closed environment as well, where it could heat up even more. So I haven't yet found a good solution to that.
Don't close it, leave the fridge door open, don't ferment in the fridge.
Yeah, it kind of defeats the point then, doesn't it? Maybe
heating is always easier. And I've had a few beers where I needed to ferment it quite warm and was really, really cold. What I would do is I would set the minimum temperature of it. So like with Belgians, I usually go 1 degree a day, and I just set that minimum. And as long as it doesn't drop that below that minimum, whatever higher it goes, it's okay.
Yeah, interesting. So actually on the Inkbird, you could kind of set the high threshold to be like 10 degrees or something, and it won't start cooling. Yeah, okay, gotcha.
James, you mentioned a compressor delay on the is that on the fridge or on the Inkbird?
On the Inkbird. There's a setting to delay the start of any cooling. So it doesn't instantly bring on. So if you have your temperature band set at like 0.1 degree or something like that. I mean, I have it set for like 1 degree. It's never really been an issue, but so you don't want to be bringing on the compressor in your fridge or freezer too often, or too quickly, and so just having that on means that it doesn't flick on straight away. So it'll wait for a couple of minutes if it's brought it on recently before bringing it on again.
I think by default it's 3 minutes.
I think the idea,
nothing, you've already got it. It's already set to 3 minutes.
I think the idea is that the compressor gets damaged more by the turning on and off, isn't it?
Yeah.
So you're just trying to, especially if you just say if your hysteresis is at 0.1 of a degree, it's going to be flickering on and off and on and off as it goes between those two very narrow temperatures.
Yeah.
You'd end up with the basically, if you've got it set too tight, you'd end up with your compressor coming on for half a minute, going off, coming on for half a minute, and so on.
this.
Obviously, that applies
Yeah.
to devices that have a compressor. If your cooling or heating method is different, then
You're pointing a fan at a wet t-shirt.
right. Any more for any more?
Yeah, I didn't think much of your wet t-shirt competition, Serge.
Well, Mark, you just need to take part, and then you'll hopefully think more of it.
Cool.
Awesome. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Serge. A round of applause, everybody.
Thanks, Serge.